The moment Georgia Whitaker stepped off the stagecoach in Redemption Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1878, the dust kicked up around her boots like the land itself was trying to warn her away. She had come from Nashville with $32, a single carpet bag, and a letter of employment from a man named Hector Baines who ran the only boarding house in town. The letter had promised a cook's position, a room of her own, and wages every Friday without fail. What it had not promised was that Hector Baines would be dead by the time she arrived, shot during a card dispute 3 weeks prior, and that his widow Edna would have no use for a cook because she was selling the establishment and moving to live with her sister in San Antonio. Georgia stood on the main street of Redemption Creek with her carpet bag at her feet, looking at a town that seemed to exist purely by accident. There was a saloon, a general store, a blacksmith's forge that threw orange sparks into the afternoon air, a small church with a crooked cross on its roof, and a sheriff's office with a jail attached to the side. The buildings were the color of dried clay. The street was unpaved and rutted from wagon wheels and horse hooves. 2 men sat outside the saloon on a wooden bench, passing a bottle between them without speaking, watching Georgia the way bored men watch anything that moves. She picked up her carpet bag and walked to the general store because it seemed like the most sensible place to ask questions. The man behind the counter was short and round-faced, with spectacles perched at the end of his nose and an ink stain on his left thumb. He introduced himself as Percy Aldridge, and he listened to Georgia's situation with genuine sympathy, tilting his head and making small sounds of concern. "That's a tough piece of luck," Percy said. "Hector was a decent man when he wasn't playing cards. His widow left Tuesday last." He tapped the counter thoughtfully. "You need work and a place to stay." "Both," Georgia said. "In that order if possible, though I'm not particular." Percy scratched his chin. "The Caldwell Ranch takes on help sometimes. They're about 4 miles east. Thomas Caldwell is a fair man. His wife Eleanor is even fairer. They've got a big spread and a lot of mouths to feed." He paused. "There's also the Monroe operation out north of town. Raymond Monroe runs cattle up near the creek bend. He doesn't usually take on household help, but he's had a rough patch lately. Lost his foreman and 2 hands to a rival outfit that offered better pay. He might be willing to work something out." "Which would you recommend?" Georgia asked. Percy considered this with real seriousness. "The Caldwells are more established, but Monroe's place is closer to town if you ever need anything." He pushed his spectacles up his nose. "I'll tell you this. Raymond Monroe is a good man, quiet, keeps to himself mostly. He's honest, which is not something you can say about everyone in Redemption Creek." Georgia thanked him and bought a small wedge of cheese and a packet of crackers, because she had not eaten since dawn, and her stomach was beginning to complain. She sat on the steps outside the general store and ate slowly, watching the town go about its afternoon business. A wagon rolled past carrying feed sacks. A woman in a blue dress crossed the street toward the church. A dog lay in a patch of shade near the blacksmith's and did not move despite the noise of the hammer and the heat of the forge. Georgia was 24 years old. She had grown up on a farm in Tennessee until her parents died within a year of each other. Her father from a fever and her mother from what the doctor called a broken constitution, but what Georgia understood to be grief. After that she had worked as a seamstress in Nashville for 2 years, then as a kitchen helper at a hotel, then as a cook's assistant at a saloon that turned out to be the wrong kind of establishment for a woman with her intentions. She had saved what she could, and when the opportunity in Redemption Creek appeared in a newspaper advertisement, she had taken it as a sign. She was not naive. She had seen enough of the world to know that signs could be misread. But she was also not the kind of woman who sat still when things went wrong. She finished her crackers and cheese, brushed the crumbs from her dress, and asked Percy Aldridge for directions to the Monroe Ranch. The walk took a little over an hour because the road north was not really a road, more of a track pressed into the earth by repeated use. The afternoon sun was still high, and the heat came off the ground in visible waves. Georgia had tied her hair back under her hat and she kept her eyes on the track, watching for snakes, which Percy had mentioned were common in the dry grass along the edges. The Monroe Ranch appeared gradually, the way things appear in flat country, first as a distant shape, then as a cluster of buildings, then as something real and specific. There was a main house built from timber and adobe, solid-looking, with a covered porch running the length of the front. Behind it stood a barn, a bunkhouse, a water trough fed by a pipe from a windmill that turned slowly in the afternoon breeze, and a series of corrals where horses moved in lazy circles. Georgia stopped at the gate post and called out because walking onto a ranch without announcing yourself was the kind of thing that got people shot, even in 1878, even in the relatively civil territory of West Texas. "Hello, the house," she called. A dog barked from somewhere around the barn. Then a man appeared from around the side of the house, wiping his hands on a cloth. He was tall, somewhere in his late 20s, with dark hair pushed back under a worn hat that had seen better days. He wore a collarless work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and his forearms were brown from the sun. He had a straight nose and a jaw that looked like it had been put together with some care, and dark eyes that measured Georgia from across the yard with an expression that was neither unfriendly nor particularly welcoming. "Help you?" he said. "I'm looking for Raymond Monroe," Georgia said. "Found him," the man said. Georgia introduced herself and explained her situation plainly, because she had found that plainness worked better than elaborate stories when you were asking strangers for work. She told him about the job in Nashville, the letter from Hector Baines, the dead man, the departing widow, the $32, and the recommendation from Percy Aldridge. Raymond Monroe listened without interrupting. He leaned against the fence post with his arms crossed, and his expression did not change much while she talked, but his eyes did, moving from that initial measuring look to something more attentive. "Percy sent you here," he said when she finished. "He said you might need household help." Raymond looked past her at the track she had walked in from, then back at her. He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not running a boarding house," he said. "This is a working ranch." "I know that," Georgia said. "I'm offering to cook and keep the house in order. I've done both. I'm not afraid of work and I don't expect to be waited on. In return, I'd need a place to sleep and fair wages." Raymond pushed off the fence post and turned toward the house. "Come on then," he said, which was not exactly an enthusiastic invitation, but Georgia had learned to accept what was offered and be grateful. The inside of the house was cleaner than she expected, but sparse. The main room served as kitchen, dining room, and sitting room all at once. There was a cast iron stove, a table with 4 chairs, a shelf of books that surprised her, a stone fireplace, and 2 windows that let in enough light to make the space feel less cramped than it was. Off the main room were 2 small bedrooms, one clearly Raymond's and one that held stacked saddle equipment and an extra bedroll. "The hands eat in the bunkhouse," Raymond said. "It's just me up here mostly. Used to be me and my foreman, Abel Garrison, but he took a better offer from the Double Cross outfit in February. He said this without bitterness, just as a fact. I manage the cooking myself, but it takes time away from the work." "What do you cook?" Georgia asked, looking at the stove. "Beans mostly. Some salt pork, coffee." He said this like he was naming obstacles rather than meals. "I can do considerably better than that," Georgia said. Something shifted in Raymond's expression, not quite a smile, but something adjacent to it. "The spare room's full of gear. I can clear it out. Wages would be $3 a week and your keep." Georgia had been making $2 a week in Nashville, but the keep made the difference. "That's fair," she said. "When would you need me to start?" "How about right now?" Raymond said. "There's dried beans soaking from last night, and I've been putting off dealing with them." Georgia set her carpet bag in the corner, rolled up her sleeves, and started cooking. The first weeks passed in the rhythm of work. Georgia rose before dawn and had coffee and biscuits ready before Raymond came in from checking the early morning condition of the horses. She cooked 3 times a day, kept the house swept, mended what needed mending, and quickly discovered that the Monroe ranch ran on a threadbare crew. Raymond had two remaining hands, brothers named Cal and Denny Hooper, who were capable riders but not reliable in other ways, and an older Mexican man named Aurelio who had been with the ranch since before Raymond's time and who served as a combination of handyman, horse healer, and institutional memory. Aurelio took to Georgia immediately. He had gentle eyes and gray-streaked hair, and he spoke English with careful precision, as though each word was a tool he had selected deliberately. He told Georgia that the ranch had been Raymond's father's originally, built up from nothing over 20 years by a man named Jonas Monroe who had died of a chest ailment 3 winters ago, leaving Raymond the land and the debt that came with it. "He works very hard," Aurelio told Georgia one afternoon while she was hanging washing and he was repairing a section of fence near the house. "More than is good for one man." "Does he have family nearby?" Georgia asked. "A sister in Abilene. They write sometimes." Aurelio hammered a nail with 2 precise strokes. "He is not a man who asks for help easily." "I noticed," Georgia said. Georgia and Raymond existed around each other in those first weeks with the careful courtesy of 2 people who have agreed to share a space and are working out the unspoken rules. He thanked her for meals with a directness that felt genuine rather than automatic. She asked before moving anything that seemed to have a designated place. They talked about practical things, the state of the well, the garden patch behind the house where she had started growing herbs, the question of whether the root cellar needed shoring up before summer. But gradually, in the evenings when the work was done, and Raymond sat on the porch with his coffee and Georgia sometimes brought her mending out to sit in the last of the daylight, they talked about other things. He had been reading a book about the geology of the American West, a thick volume with plates of rock formations in it, and one evening he mentioned something from it because she had asked about the red stone buttes she could see on the horizon to the southwest. "Those are sandstone," he said, "built up over millions of years from sediment. Before this was dry land, it was underwater, all of it." Georgia looked at the flat, sun-cracked earth around them and tried to imagine it as the floor of an ancient sea. "That's hard to picture," she said. "Most things are until they happen." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Where did you grow up?" She told him about Tennessee and the farm and her parents, and he listened the way he had listened to her initial explanation on the first day, with complete attention and without offering unsolicited comments. When she finished, he said, "That took courage coming out here alone." "Necessity more than courage," Georgia said. "Sometimes they're the same thing," he said. There was a particular evening in late April when a thunderstorm rolled in from the west with the speed and fury that storms gather in open country where there is nothing to slow them down. Georgia had been in the garden when the sky turned green-gray and the wind shifted, and she ran for the house just as the first fat drops hit the dust. Raymond came in from the barn at the same time, and they collided on the porch steps, his hands catching her shoulders to keep her from falling. It lasted only a moment. He steadied her and let go, and they both went inside. But Georgia was very aware of the steadiness of those hands, the ease with which they had simply been there. The storm threw rain against the windows and lightning lit the sky in rapid stuttering flashes. They sat at the kitchen table with the lantern between them, and Georgia found herself talking more freely than she usually allowed herself to, about Nashville and the disappointments there, about the particular loneliness of being capable and finding no good use for that capability. Raymond listened, and then, to her surprise, talked more openly than he had before. He talked about the debt on the ranch, about 2 bad winters that had hit the cattle hard, about the difficulty of building something when the ground itself seemed to resist you. He talked about his father with a complicated mix of admiration and the sadness of unfinished things. His father had been a determined man, but not an easy one. "He never told me outright that he was proud of me," Raymond said. "I knew it, I think, but he wasn't built for that kind of saying." "Some men aren't," Georgia said. "Are you built for it?" Raymond asked. "For saying things directly." Georgia looked at him across the table. "More than most," she said. "It's not always an advantage." He smiled then, a real one. and she realized it was the first full smile she had seen from him. It changed his face considerably, opened it up, and she felt something shift in her chest like a door coming off the latch. May arrived and brought with it a problem. A man named Claude Decker had been circling the edges of Redemption Creek for several weeks, a land speculator from Houston who had been quietly buying up struggling properties. He had already acquired 2 farms south of town, and word came to Raymond through Aurelio that Decker was interested in the Monroe Ranch, specifically because the creek bend on its northern border provided reliable water, which in the dry country of West Texas was more valuable than gold. Raymond received this information at the breakfast table one morning and sat with it quietly for a long time. Georgia refilled his coffee and did not ask, but he told her anyway. Decker made an offer to Abel Garrison before Abel left, Raymond said. Abel told me before he went. The offer was to Abel, not to me. Decker was trying to learn how leveraged I was. How leveraged are you? Georgia asked. Enough that a bad year would hurt, Raymond said. Not enough that a bad year would end it. He looked out the window. As long as I can get this season's cattle to market in decent numbers. Then you make sure the cattle get to market, Georgia said. He looked at her. Simple as that. The problem is simple, she said. The doing of it is what's hard. He nodded slowly. Something in his expression said that he appreciated being given the straightforward version instead of the complicated one. Georgia drove into Redemption Creek that Thursday on the supply wagon with a list of things needed for the house. While Percy Aldridge was filling the order, she learned more about Claude Decker, who had apparently made an appearance in town the day before and had lunch at the saloon with 3 men Percy described as lawyers or something like lawyers. He's circling, Percy said. That's what he does. He finds a weak point and then he waits. Patience is his main skill. Georgia thought about this on the drive back. She was not the kind of woman who believed in waiting for problems to arrive at full size before dealing with them. When she got back, she told Raymond what she had heard and also told him what she thought. If Decker is looking for a weak point, then you close the weak points. Get the cattle ready for the drive earlier than you'd planned. Get ahead of any debt you can. Show the bank you're operating. Raymond was quiet for a moment. I've been thinking about asking Holt Reardon to ride with us on the drive. He's a good man, used to work for my father. He's been in between outfits since November. Then ask him, Georgia said. He gave her that look again, the one that said her directness registered with him in a particular way. You're not worried about telling me what to do, he said. I'm not telling you what to do, Georgia said. I'm agreeing with what you're already thinking and making it seem more decided. This time he laughed, a short, real sound, and Georgia felt the shift in her chest again, deeper this time. Raymond rode into town the next day and came back with Holt Reardon, who was a lean, good-natured man of about 40, with sun-damaged skin and hands like leather, and the easy confidence of someone who has spent his entire adult life on horseback. He moved into the bunkhouse with Cal and Denny Hooper, and from the first morning the atmosphere of the ranch changed, became more purposeful. Georgia watched Raymond with Holt and saw how Raymond operated with someone he trusted. He talked more, moved with more certainty, made decisions faster. He was a different kind of quiet than usual, not the quiet of a man alone, but the quiet of a man who doesn't need to fill space with words because the work speaks for itself. June came and the days grew long and burning. Georgia adapted her cooking to the heat, making things that didn't require the stove to run all afternoon, cold meat and bread and pickled vegetables and corn cakes in the early morning when the heat was still manageable. She took to sitting on the porch in the evenings with a glass of water cooled in the well, and Raymond developed the habit of joining her. They talked every evening now, not always about important things. Sometimes about the books on his shelf which she had begun to read from, or about her memories of Tennessee, or about the strange and specific sounds the desert made at night, the distant call of something she couldn't identify, the way the wind moved through the dry grass with a sound like breathing. One evening she found him sitting on the porch looking at a letter. He held it a certain way, not reading it but looking at it. "From your sister?" she asked. "Yes." He set it on the railing. "She's asking me to come to Abilene for a visit. She worries." He paused. "She wants to know about you, actually." Georgia felt a small, surprised warmth. "How does she know about me?" "I wrote her," Raymond said, with a casualness that told her he had thought carefully about whether to mention this. "I wrote her in April, told her I'd taken on a cook. She wrote back immediately with a great many questions." "What kind of questions?" Georgia asked. He looked at the letter on the railing. "The kind that sisters ask," he said, and left it at that, but his expression when he said it was not the expression of a man who found his sister's questions unreasonable. Georgia felt something pulling tight in her, a happiness and a careful holding back of that happiness at the same time. She was aware of the precariousness of her situation. She was an employee. She was a woman alone who depended on this man's goodwill for her livelihood and her roof. She had promised herself in Nashville that she would not let her feelings run ahead of her practical circumstances again. But Raymond Monroe was a hard man to be careful about. He was kind without performing kindness. He was honest without using honesty as a weapon. He worked harder than any two men Georgia had known, and did it without drama or complaint. He noticed things: the way she favored her left hand when her right was tired, the way she looked south when she was thinking about Tennessee, the way she got quiet when she was worried rather than when she was content. And when he noticed things, he did something about them quietly. A smaller task shifted away from her hand without comment, a cup of coffee placed near her elbow without being asked for. She was in trouble and she knew it, and she cooked excellent suppers and refused to think about it directly. The cattle drive was planned for early July. Raymond intended to move 230 head up through the northern range to Amarillo, where a cattle buyer named Swanson had agreed to a fair price. The drive would take 12 days and require Raymond, Holt, Cal, and Denny all to go, leaving the ranch in Aurelio's care. The night before the drive, Georgia made a meal that was probably excessive for a working ranch supper: a beef stew with dried apples and onions, fresh bread, and a dried peach pie she had been planning since she bought the peaches from Percy's store 2 weeks before. She did not think about why she had been planning this particular meal for 2 weeks. Raymond came in from the last checks on the horses and stopped when he saw the table set with actual care rather than just function. He looked at Georgia, and something in his expression was warm and searching at the same time. "This is quite a send-off," he said. "You're taking my source of income across a considerable amount of hostile territory," Georgia said. "I thought a proper meal was the least I could do." They ate with Holt and Cal and Denny and Aurelio, and the conversation was good, full of stories and laughter, the kind that happens when people who have been working together find themselves briefly at rest. Holt told a story about a cattle drive he had done 10 years before that had gone wrong in every possible way, recounted with such cheerful good humor that the disasters seemed almost charming. After supper, the hands drifted to the bunkhouse and Aurelio went to his small room off the barn. Georgia was washing up the dishes and Raymond was at the table with the map of the route laid out, tracing the line with his finger when he said without looking up, "Georgia." "Yes," she said. "I'll be back in 2 weeks," he said, "maybe a little less if the weather cooperates." "I know," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I want you to know that this place is yours while I'm gone, not just the kitchen, all of it. If anything needs deciding, you decide it. Aurelio will back you up." Georgia set down the dish she was drying and turned to look at him. He had looked up from the map. They looked at each other across the kitchen, and Georgia felt the full weight of what was happening between them, which was something real and undeniable, and which neither of them had said plainly yet. "Be careful," she said, because it was true and because it was what she could say. "I intend to be," Raymond said, with a gravity that went beyond the practical meaning of the words. He left at first light before Georgia was up. She heard the horses, the low voices of the men, the creak of the gate. She lay in her room for a while listening to the sounds of them leaving, and then got up and made coffee, and stood on the porch watching the dust of their going settle slowly back to earth. The 2 weeks were longer than any 2 weeks she had previously endured. She worked, because there was always work. She maintained the garden, kept the house, helped Aurelio with 2 horses that had minor ailments, drove to town twice for supplies, and one afternoon helped a neighbor woman named Ruth Calloway who had stopped at the gate in a wagon with a stuck wheel. Georgia and Aurelio fixed the wheel and Ruth stayed for coffee, and turned out to be the most comprehensively well-informed person in Redemption Creek, knowing the business of every family within a 20-mile radius with a thoroughness that was almost professional. Ruth noticed, with the precision of a woman who has noted such things all her life, the particular way Georgia spoke about Raymond Monroe. "You're fond of him," Ruth said, with neither judgment nor particular surprise. "He's a fair employer," Georgia said. Ruth smiled into her coffee cup. "That's not what I said, and that's not what you heard me say." Georgia did not answer this, which Ruth clearly took as sufficient confirmation. The 14th day after the drive left, Georgia was in the garden in the late afternoon when she heard hooves on the track and looked up to see the dust of horses coming from the north. She stood up slowly, shading her eyes, and watched the shapes resolve from dust into men and horses and cattle, heard the distant low calls of cattle being pushed into the final homeward stretch. She went inside and put on fresh coffee and started on supper. Raymond came through the gate dirty and sunburned and tired in the way that goes down to the bone. He left his horse with Cal and came straight to the house and stopped in the doorway of the kitchen where Georgia was standing, and for a moment neither of them said anything. He looked older by a fraction, which 2 weeks of hard sun and hard driving will do. He looked at her as though confirming something he had been thinking about for the whole time he was away. "The drive went well," he said. "Swanson paid a fair price. We're clear of the worst of the debt." "I'm glad," Georgia said. She handed him a cup of coffee. He took it and his fingers brushed hers, and neither of them moved away from that contact immediately. It lasted only a second, the brushing of hands, but it registered between them like something spoken. "The garden looks good," he said, looking out the window at it. "The tomatoes are coming in," she said. "I've been waiting to make sauce." "Good," he said. Then, as though he had been holding this ready for 2 weeks and had decided to simply say it, "I thought about you a fair amount while I was gone." Georgia set down the spoon she was holding. "I thought about you too," she said. Raymond set his coffee cup down on the table. He took one step toward her and then stopped, and there was in his eyes the question that she had been watching form for weeks, built out of evenings on the porch and thunderstorm conversations and coffee cups, and the particular quiet between two people who have been figuring each other out. "Georgia," he said, "I want to be clear with you. I don't mean anything casual. If I'm misreading this, I'll say no more about it and we'll carry on as we have been. But I don't think I am misreading it." Georgia Whitaker, who had come west with $32 and a dead man's promise, and had instead found herself standing in a kitchen she had made her own, looked at Raymond Monroe and felt everything in her that had been held carefully in check simply let go. "You're not misreading it," she said. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps, and when he kissed her it was not tentative. It was the kiss of a man who had made a decision completely, and she kissed him back with the same certainty, because she had made that decision herself several weeks ago and had simply been waiting for a moment like this one. They stood in the kitchen with the coffee going and the supper cooking and the evening light coming orange through the window, and held each other with the straightforwardness of two people who have stopped pretending. Holt Reardon came to the door, saw them, made a quiet sound of satisfaction that was not quite a word, and left without knocking. The summer unfolded with a kind of joy that Georgia had not experienced in its full form before. The days were still long and hot and full of work, but the work had a different quality now, shared rather than parallel. Raymond brought her wildflowers from the creek bend sometimes, nothing elaborate, just a handful of the small yellow ones that grew in the shallow water, presented with the same directness he applied to everything else. She found that she looked for moments throughout the day when their paths would cross, at the water trough, or the fence, or the edge of the garden, and that his eyes found her the same way. They talked constantly. In the evenings on the porch after supper, on Sunday mornings when the ranch was quieter. They talked about everything that mattered, which was the future, which was what they both wanted, which was whether the ranch could grow into something that supported more than one person's survival. Raymond was not a man who assumed. He asked her directly, one evening in July with the fireflies starting up in the tall grass beyond the fence, whether she saw her future in Texas or whether she thought about going back east. "I don't think about going back," Georgia said. "I stopped thinking about it sometime around May." "May," he said with a private satisfaction. "When did you stop thinking of me as simply an employee?" she asked. He thought about it honestly. "I'm not sure I ever entirely did," he said, "which I tried to hold in check because it didn't seem right when there was a power imbalance. You depended on me for your livelihood. And now," she said. He looked at her. "Now I think we depend on each other for considerably more important things." In August, Claude Decker came to the ranch. He was a well-dressed man of about 50, with a neatly trimmed gray beard and a traveling coat that cost more than most of Redemption Creek's monthly wages. He arrived in a good carriage with a driver and came to the front gate with the confidence of a man who was accustomed to being received. Georgia was the one who went to the gate because Raymond was working the far pasture. She looked at Decker from the other side of the fence and waited. "I'm looking for Raymond Monroe," Decker said pleasantly. "He's working," Georgia said. "He'll be back toward evening. You can wait or you can come back." Decker looked at her with the assessing look of a man who evaluates things by their market value. "And you are?" "Someone who works here," Georgia said. Decker smiled at this in a way that had a small unpleasantness to it. "I'll wait," he said. "If it's not too much trouble." She gave him water and did not offer him anything more, and he sat on the porch bench and looked at the property with the calculating eyes of a man doing arithmetic. Raymond came in at the normal time, saw Decker, and his face settled into the careful neutral expression Georgia had come to recognize as his professional one. The conversation between the two men happened on the porch while Georgia stayed in the kitchen with the window open. She listened without guilt because she considered it important information. Decker offered to buy the ranch. He named a price that was somewhat generous and framed it in the language of opportunity, the chance to start fresh somewhere else, the difficulty of one man running a spread this size, the practicalities of the cattle market. Raymond listened to all of it and then said, "No." Decker recalibrated and began the second approach, which was about the limitations of the property, the ongoing drought cycles in West Texas, the uncertain future of small cattle operations. He said all of this with a thoughtful concern that was practiced and not real. Raymond said, "I appreciate your time." Decker tried a third approach, which was to suggest that Raymond had people depending on him, that making responsible decisions required considering others, and he glanced toward the kitchen window in a way that made George's hands tighten on the counter. Raymond's voice changed slightly, became quieter and more absolute. "The ranch is not for sale," he said. "It will not be for sale. I'd ask you not to come back with the same offer. I'm asking politely now." Decker left. Raymond came into the kitchen and Georgia turned to face him. His expression was controlled, but there was something working behind it. "He implied a threat," Georgia said. "It was not a question." "He implied he would find leverage somewhere," Raymond said. "That's how men like that operate." He sat down at the table. "He won't find much. The bank is satisfied with our progress. The land title is clear." "Percy told me he's been talking to the county land office," Georgia said. "Ruth Calloway mentioned it last week. He's been asking about water rights, specifically about the creek." Raymond looked at her. "How long have you known that?" "Since last week," Georgia said. "I was waiting until I had something more specific before I told you because I didn't want to worry you about shadows." He rubbed his jaw. "What else do you know?" "That he has friends at the land office in Austin. That he's done this before in 2 counties east of here, and that in both cases the ranchers sold eventually because the legal complications around water rights became impossible to manage without expensive lawyers." Raymond was quiet for a long moment. "You've been paying attention." "It's my home," Georgia said, and then stopped, because she had said it without thinking and the word home hung in the air between them with all its weight. Raymond looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "Yes, it is." And the way he said it resolved something that had been building for months. He proposed to her on a Sunday morning in September, in the garden, informally and completely, standing among the last of the summer tomatoes with his hat in his hands, and an expression of such earnest seriousness that Georgia felt it like a physical warmth spreading through her. He said that he loved her and that he had loved her for a long time, and that he understood she had come to Texas looking for independence and security, and that he was not asking her to give those things up, but rather to build them alongside him, and that if she would marry him, he would spend however long they had together making sure she never regretted leaving Nashville. Georgia said yes before he finished, and then apologized for interrupting, and Raymond said he didn't mind being interrupted for that reason. They were married in October at the small church in Redemption Creek with the crooked cross on its roof. Percy Aldridge stood as witness because he considered himself the indirect cause of the whole thing and was accordingly proud. Ruth Calloway organized the reception at the town hall, a celebration that involved a fiddle player, an enormous amount of food contributed by nearly every woman in the area, and Holt Reardon dancing a jig that nobody expected from a man of his general demeanor. Aurelio cried, which he did not attempt to hide, and was so unashamed about it that several other people cried too. Georgia wore the best dress she owned, the dark blue one from Nashville that she had packed in her carpet bag without any particular reason, some instinct, and Raymond wore a coat she had never seen before, dark and well-fitted, which he admitted he had ordered from a tailor in Amarillo 3 weeks earlier. At the ceremony, the preacher, a small, intense man named Reverend Cross, who took the solemnity of marriage with complete seriousness, asked Raymond to speak his commitment in his own words as was the custom of the church, and Raymond looked at Georgia and said, with the same directness he applied to everything, "Georgia, I will be honest with you every day I live. I will work beside you and not just in front of you. I will listen when you speak, and I will not make decisions that belong to both of us without you." "That is what I promise." Georgia said when it was her turn, "Raymond, I came to Texas looking for something solid to build on. I found better than that. I found someone to build with. I'll be beside you through whatever comes. That's mine to keep." After the ceremony and the dancing and the food and the long, warm conversation of an October evening, they drove home to the ranch in the wagon under a sky so full of stars it looked structural, like something holding the world up from above. The ranch felt different when they came home to it. Not because anything had changed, but because everything had, in the way that happens when a place becomes entirely yours rather than partially. They sat on the porch for a while in the cool night and held hands and did not say much and did not need to. The matter of Claude Decker was not finished. In November, a letter arrived from the county land office raising questions about the Monroe Ranch's water rights at the creek bend. Raymond took the letter to town and showed it to the only lawyer in Redemption Creek, a methodical man named Jonathan Strake, who had moved there from Dallas the year before and who read the letter with narrowing eyes and said that it was the beginning of what he called a paper siege. Jonathan Strake was expensive, and Raymond paid him out of the cattle drive money without telling Georgia how much, until Georgia found the receipt book and did the arithmetic and presented the number to him at breakfast. "I should have told you," Raymond said. "Yes," Georgia said. "We agreed about decisions." He agreed that he had made a mistake, and they argued about it, the first real argument, and it was a revelation to Georgia because Raymond argued as he did everything else, without deflection, without minimizing, without turning it back on her. He said where he was wrong and why he had done it and what he would do differently, and Georgia matched him in this, and it ended not with one of them winning, but with both of them having said every true thing they thought about it. Afterward, Raymond said, "Is it wrong that I found that somewhat clarifying?" Georgia said, No, because so did I. Jonathan Strake, working with the information Georgia had gathered over months about Decker's methods, filed a counterclaim with the county land office that established clearly, and with full documentation, the Monroe Ranch's historical right to the creek water. He also wrote a letter to a judge in Austin, who apparently had professional reasons to dislike Claude Decker's land practices, and who took a personal interest in reviewing Decker's filings. It took 4 months and cost a significant portion of what they had saved. But in March of 1879, a formal decision came from Austin ruling that the creek water rights were unambiguously and entirely the property of the Monroe Ranch. Decker moved on to his next target in the next county. The morning the letter came, Raymond read it at the breakfast table and then set it down and looked at Georgia across the table, and they smiled at each other. The deep, satisfied smile of two people who have held a line together and held it successfully. By spring of 1879, the ranch had found its footing. Raymond hired 2 additional hands, good men recommended by Holt, and expanded the cattle operation by leasing an additional section of grazing land to the east. Georgia took over the ranch's record-keeping, the accounts and the correspondence and the ordering, because she was better at it than Raymond was, which he admitted with a frankness she appreciated. They were also, by that spring, expecting their first child. Georgia told Raymond on a February evening, simply, directly, in the kitchen after supper. He received the information with a stillness that lasted about 3 seconds and then stood up from the table and pulled her to him with a gentleness that she had come to know as his specific form of great feeling. He said, very quietly, "Are you all right?" "Perfectly well," she said. "I want you to tell me if you need anything different. If the work needs adjusting." "I'm not made of glass," she said. "I know that," he said, "but you're carrying something precious and I intend to be attentive about it." She felt the warmth of this spread through her completely. "All right," she said. "I'll tell you when I need things adjusted." They wrote to Raymond's sister in Abilene. Her name was Clara, and her letter back arrived within the week, full of such enthusiasm and practical advice that it covered both sides of 3 full pages. Clara had 2 children of her own, and treated the upcoming addition to the Monroe family as an event she intended to be comprehensively involved in from any distance. Aurelio received the news with the same calm that Aurelio received everything, but his expression when he heard it was the particular kind of happiness that belongs to people who have watched something good grow from the beginning. Ruth Calloway organized a gathering for Georgia among the women of the area, which in the language of Redemption Creek was as close to a celebration as frontier life allowed for, and which resulted in a remarkable collection of useful items assembled by women who knew precisely what was needed and contributed accordingly. The summer of 1879 was a better year than the summer before. The cattle thrived. The garden produced beyond what Georgia had hoped. The house was changed in small but significant ways, a cradle that Raymond built himself in the evenings, working at it for 3 weeks with a concentration she found deeply moving, a new window he cut in the spare room to give it more light, curtains that Georgia sewed from cloth she had been saving. Clara came from Abilene in August. She was a few years older than Raymond, with the same dark eyes but a quickness to her expression that Raymond did not share. She and Georgia recognized each other immediately as natural allies, and within an afternoon were in a conversation that Raymond observed from across the room, with the contentment of a man watching 2 people he loves getting along. Clara stayed for 3 weeks and helped with the preparations, and in the evenings, when Raymond was on the porch, she and Georgia sat at the kitchen table and talked about everything, about Raymond as a boy, which Georgia heard with great interest, about Clara's husband James, who was a sensible man but had no imagination, about children, about the West, about what women could and could not do within the structures the world offered them, and how much could be bent if you went at it with the right angle. The baby came in September. A boy, strong-lunged and dark-haired, who arrived into the world in the bedroom of the Monroe Ranch house with the help of Ruth Calloway, who had delivered half the babies in the county and was calm and capable throughout. Raymond waited in the kitchen with Clara and Aurelio, and when Ruth came out and told him he had a healthy son, he sat down at the kitchen table and put his face in his hands, not from grief, but from the full weight of something too large to hold upright. They named him Jonas, for Raymond's father, because it seemed right to carry that name forward and give it a new beginning. Jonas Monroe was a loud, demanding, magnificently healthy baby who changed the character of the ranch entirely within the first weeks of his life. Aurelio carved him a small horse from mesquite wood. Holt Reardon stood in the doorway of the house, holding the boy with the extreme care of a man who has handled things roughly his entire life, and is now suddenly required to handle something breakable, and looked at Georgia with eyes that held something unexpectedly moved. Raymond was, Georgia discovered, a natural father. He took to Jonas with the same wholehearted commitment he gave everything, sleeping lightly to hear him in the night, learning his patterns with the same attentiveness with which he had learned the patterns of horses and weather and Georgia herself. He held the baby against his chest in the evenings on the porch, looking out at the land, and Georgia watched them from inside and felt a happiness so deep it was almost solemn. She was also deeply tired, as all women with new babies are, and Raymond understood this and managed accordingly. He redistributed the household work without being asked. He made sure there was always coffee when she needed it. He took Jonas on horseback walks in the mornings when the boy was fussing, and the rocking of the horse settled him in a way nothing else did. By November, Jonas was sleeping better and Georgia had recovered her full energy, and the ranch settled into its new configuration as a family home rather than just a working property. Clara came back for Christmas. James came this time as well, a solid, serious man who warmed visibly under George's cooking, and who spent the holiday in earnest conversation with Raymond about cattle market trends and land prices and the future of the Texas range. Their children, a boy of 7 named Henry and a girl of 5 named Bess, treated the ranch as an adventure and followed Aurelio everywhere and asked him questions about horses with an intensity that he answered with complete patience. Christmas on the Monroe Ranch was a real celebration. Georgia cooked for 3 days beforehand. Raymond cut a cedar tree from the far edge of the property, and they decorated it with the few ornaments Georgia had in her carpet bag, which she had carried from Nashville for no reason she could name at the time, and with paper shapes she and Clara cut in the evenings. They sat together on Christmas evening, the fire going, Jonas asleep in his cradle, Henry and Bess finally worn out and put to bed, and the 4 adults were quiet for a while in the way of people who have shared enough that silence is comfortable. Raymond looked around at the room, at Georgia, at Clara and James, at the sleeping baby and the tree with its paper decorations, and the expression on his face was the one Georgia had learned to read as his deepest contentment, not demonstrative but absolute. "Good year," he said. It was the kind of understatement that contained everything. The years that followed were building years, and Georgia remembered them later as having a quality of light that was specific to that time, the light of things growing into what they were meant to be. Raymond expanded the cattle operation steadily and without overextension. He was not a reckless man. He grew as the land allowed and the market supported, and Georgia's careful management of the accounts meant they always had a clear picture of exactly where they stood. They hired additional hands as the herd grew, and the bunkhouse was expanded to accommodate them, and the ranch became a small community of its own with its own rhythms and personalities. Georgia's garden grew too, until it was less a garden and more a significant production, enough to preserve through winter with considerable surplus that she sold in town through Percy's store. She also, over time, began to take a hand in teaching the children of some of the ranch hands to read, because several of the men had children who rode in from nearby homesteads and had no access to the small school that operated in Redemption Creek 2 days a week. This teaching work was something Georgia had not planned but fell into naturally, and which gave her a satisfaction different from but equal to the satisfaction of a well-run household or a successful day of accounts. Raymond watched this develop with a kind of quiet pride that he expressed by building her a small addition to the house, just one room, nothing elaborate, which he fitted with a proper table and chairs and enough shelves for books, and which became the place where she taught on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. She did not ask him to do this. He did it because he had been watching and he understood. "You need the right space for the right work," he said, when she stood in the doorway of the new room looking at it. "You built this without telling me," she said. "I wanted to see your face when you saw it," he said. She turned around, and he was watching her with that private smile she had come to know as hers, the one that was not for general use. She kissed him in the middle of the doorway of the new room with the smell of fresh-cut timber around them. In 1881, when Jonas was nearly 2 years old, Georgia became pregnant again. She told Raymond in the same way she had told him the first time, plainly, at the kitchen table after supper. He received it with the same stillness followed by the same gentleness. "Two," he said. "Two," she agreed. "The house can hold two," he said. "The house can hold several more than two," Georgia said. "You built it solidly." He looked at the house around him with the satisfaction of a builder who has been told his work was good. "I did," he said. "My father taught me that much." This second pregnancy was easier in some ways and harder in others. Georgia was more tired than the first time, partly because Jonas was a busy 2-year-old who required continuous attention and surveillance. Aurelio, who had given himself the role of Jonas's particular guardian, stepped up his attentiveness to the boy in a way that freed Georgia considerably. The baby was born in the spring of 1882, on a morning when the desert was in its brief and brilliant bloom, when every flat brown surface had apparently been secretly accumulating wildflowers for a year and was now releasing them all at once. Georgia had always considered this brief flowering the most beautiful thing about West Texas, and it seemed fitting. They had a daughter this time. Georgia looked at her in the first minutes and felt the same enormous opening that she had felt with Jonas, the same sense of something new and permanent. They named her Lily, for Georgia's mother, whose given name had been Lillian. Jonas regarded his sister with the serious expression of a nearly 3-year-old attempting to understand a significant development. He sat beside Georgia in the bed and looked at the baby and then at his mother and said, "She's very small." "She'll grow," Georgia said. "You were that small." Jonas appeared to find this information unconvincing. Holt Reardon, who had by now been with the ranch for 4 years and was as much a fixture as Aurelio, announced within the month that he was planning to ask a widow named Mee Tilson to marry him. Mee Tilson ran a laundry in Redemption Creek and was a large, good-humored woman with red hair and strong opinions, and she and Holt had apparently been moving toward each other at the deliberate pace of two people who have had enough mistakes in their lives to take the present decision seriously. Georgia celebrated this news with sincere warmth. She had grown fond of Holt in the way you grow fond of people who have been consistently decent over a long period of time, and Mee Tilson was exactly the right kind of person for him. Holt and Mee were married in the spring, a simpler affair than Raymond and George's wedding but no less joyful, and Mee moved into a small house at the edge of the Monroe property that Raymond built for them, because Holt had earned it, and Raymond was not a man who let earned things go unacknowledged. The ranch in 1883 was a different thing from the struggling, undermanned operation Georgia had walked into in 1878. It employed 8 hands, maintained a herd of 560 cattle, leased grazing rights over a significant additional acreage, and operated a side trade in horses that Raymond had developed with Holt's expertise. The account books, kept in Georgia's clear hand, showed a consistent profitability that would have seemed impossible in the debt-shadowed days of Claude Decker's circling. Decker himself had apparently overextended in a land deal in the New Mexico territory, and was no longer a feature of Texas county land offices. Georgia had heard this from Jonathan Strake, who had remained a friend after the water rights case, and who still operated his law practice in Redemption Creek with the same methodical care he had brought to their defense. Jonas was now 4 years old and had developed Raymond's quietness combined with Georgia's directness, which produced a child who did not speak often but who, when he did, said things so exactly to the point that adults around him frequently looked at each other in surprised recognition. He followed Raymond everywhere on the ranch with a devotion that was entirely mutual, and Raymond taught him things with a patience and thoroughness that made Georgia watch them sometimes from a distance with a feeling so full it was almost painful. Lily was 1 year old and moving through the house at a speed that suggested she had decided walking was an unnecessary intermediate step and had gone directly to something approaching running. She had Georgia's coloring and Raymond's determination, and already had a personality so vivid and certain that Aurelio said she would either be a great leader or a force of nature, and the distinction was possibly not important. In the autumn of 1883, Clara came from Abilene with the news that James had been offered a position at a large ranch in New Mexico Territory, and that they were considering the move. This news arrived with a complexity that Georgia understood. Clara loved the life she had in Abilene, but James's opportunity was genuinely significant, the kind that came once. They sat at the kitchen table over several evenings and talked it through with the same honesty that Georgia had come to consider the essential quality of the Monroe family. Clara went to New Mexico. It was the right decision for her and James. They wrote regularly, long letters that arrived with the detailed observation of someone describing a new country they have decided to love. Her children Henry and Bess grew up in that different landscape and came to visit Texas occasionally, growing taller each time, and the connection between the families held steady across the distance. Georgia missed Clara in the specific way you miss someone who became necessary to you as an adult, not the primary grief of childhood loss, but the particular ache of a friendship that has to exist across geography. Raymond understood this and made sure the letters were answered promptly, and that Georgia had the paper and ink and time to write the long, detailed letters she sent back. In 1884, Raymond made a trip to Abilene for a cattle market conference and brought Georgia with him. It was the first time she had been further than Amarillo since arriving in Texas 6 years before. They left Jonas and Lily with Aurelio and me and Holt, and the confidence with which they left them told Georgia how much the world around the ranch had grown into something reliable. Abilene was larger and louder than Georgia expected, a different texture of civilization than the particular quietness of Redemption Creek. They stayed at a hotel that was, by any reasonable standard, quite good, and Georgia slept in a real hotel bed for the first time in years and found she preferred her own bed, which she considered a sign of how thoroughly she had become a rancher's wife. Raymond attended the conference, and Georgia walked through Abilene, looked in shop windows, bought a length of good cloth for a dress she planned to make, sat in a coffee house and read a newspaper from Dallas, and felt the larger world moving along its channels. She thought about who she had been when she walked into Percy Aldridge's general store 6 years before, $32 and a dead man's employment letter, and the specific determination of someone with nothing left to lose. She thought about what she had now, which was so much more than she had planned for that it seemed almost impolite to have received it all. That evening she and Raymond ate supper in the hotel dining room, and it was the first meal in a very long time that someone else had cooked for them. Raymond ate with the appreciation of a man who knows good cooking and said about the beef roast, "Yours is better." "You don't need to say that," Georgia said. "I'm saying it because it's true," he said. "I've never been able to get away with flattery with you. You'd know immediately." "You've never tried flattery," she said. "No," he agreed. It seemed like a poor strategy from the beginning. They walked after supper in the Abilene evening, which was mild and smelled of the plains, and a little of coal smoke from the train yard. Raymond took her hand and kept it. She was 30 years old and he was 31, and they had been married 5 years, and the specific pleasure of walking through a public street with him, of being known as his wife and knowing him as her husband, had not lost its quality. Some things, Georgia had found, did not diminish with familiarity but rather deepened, became more exactly themselves. She was pregnant again, though she had not yet told Raymond. She had found out the week before the Abilene trip, and had kept it while she confirmed it to herself, the way she always needed a day or two to hold news privately before sharing it. She told him that evening sitting by the window of the hotel room with the lights of Abilene outside and Raymond reading, as he always did before sleep, the current book, which was a geological survey of the Texas Panhandle. He set the book down with such gentleness it made no sound. He looked at her and then out the window and then back at her. 3, he said. 3, Georgia confirmed. He smiled, the full smile, the one she had first seen at the kitchen table during that April thunderstorm 7 years ago in a ranch kitchen that had become home. "The house is big enough," he said. "The house is entirely big enough," she said. She moved to the chair beside his, and he put his arm around her, and they looked out at Abilene together in the comfortable quiet of two people who have established their world so thoroughly that even new developments fit within it. The third baby was born in the spring of 1885, another boy, whom they named after Aurelio, which was a decision Georgia made, and presented to Raymond, who received it with the particular warmth of a man who had been trying to think of how to honor the same person. When they told Aurelio the name, he stood in the kitchen doorway for a long moment not speaking, and then nodded once with the precise dignity of a man receiving something that goes deeper than he can immediately express. Little Aurelio, who was called really almost from the first week in the way of names that find their shortened forms naturally, was a different kind of baby than either Jonah's or Lily. He was quiet and observant, with large dark eyes that watched everything around him with a seriousness that his godmother Ruth Calloway, who had delivered all 3 Monroe children, said was the look of someone who was taking notes. Jonah's was 5 and had begun attending the school in Redemption Creek on the 3 days a week it operated, riding in on a small brown horse that Raymond had chosen for him with great care, a patient animal with a sensible disposition that took to Jonah's immediately. Lily was 3, and was at the age of constant loud commentary on the world around her, narrating her experiences with a fluency and enthusiasm that filled the house with sound. The summer of 1885 was a good one and a hard one both. A drought that had been building in the southern ranges moved through the area in July and August and pressed the cattle operation. Raymond managed it carefully, moving the herd to the northern pastures near the creek where the water held, rationing grazing ranges, making decisions early and precisely. Georgia watched him handle the pressure with a steadiness that she had observed in him through other hard times and which always moved her. The quality of a person who does not fall apart when falling apart would be the understandable response. They lost some cattle, fewer than their neighbors because of Raymond's early responses, but some. And the accounts at the end of the summer were leaner than either of them wanted. Georgia sat with the books that September and went through the numbers with the systematic honesty she applied to everything and presented Raymond with the exact picture at the dinner table. "We're not comfortable," she said, "but we're stable. If next year's season is normal, we recover fully in 2 years. And if next year isn't normal," Raymond asked. "Then we make different decisions," Georgia said. "But we make them from stability, not from crisis. That's the difference between now and 1878. Raymond looked at her across the table. "You've been keeping us stable," he said. "Not just the accounts, all of it." "We've been keeping each other stable," Georgia said. "That was the agreement." He reached across the table and took her hand and held it, a simple gesture, the kind that had become the language of everything important between them. The next year was normal. The year after was better than normal. By 1887, the ranch had recovered fully and pushed beyond the previous level. Raymond made an arrangement with a cattle buyer in Fort Worth that gave them more consistent pricing than the Amarillo market had. Georgia's teaching had grown into something that occupied 4 afternoons a week and had produced, among other outcomes, 3 children of ranch hands who had learned to read with enough fluency to eventually leave for schooling in Amarillo and Dallas. She was proud of this in the way she was proud of the garden and the accounts and the house and the ranch, which was the pride of something built carefully over time. Holt Reardon and me had a son in 1886, born healthy and large-voiced, named John after Holt's father, and the Monroe and Reardon families became close in the way of people who live near each other, and have helped each other through enough things that the connection is structural rather than social. Aurelio, who was aging but showed no signs of slowing, remained the fixed center of the ranch's horse operation, his knowledge of animals deep and specific in the way of someone who has spent 50 years observing them. Raymond learned from him constantly and without ego, the way you learn from someone you respect entirely. In the spring of 1888, Jonas turned 9, and it became clear that he had his father's natural affinity with horses and cattle, and the land's particular logic. He was not like other children of his age in Redemption Creek, in that he had the quality of patient attentiveness that usually takes decades to develop. Teachers at the school noted it. Georgia saw it every day and felt the complicated joy of watching your child become themselves. Lily at 6 was a different kind of remarkable. She had taught herself to read at 4 by sitting beside Georgia in the teaching room and listening with the intensity of someone absorbing everything in the room. By 6, she was reading Raymond's geology books, working through the long words with a determination that had both her parents watching her with private amazement. Little Riley at 3 was, as Ruth Calloway had predicted, clearly taking notes on everything. He watched and he remembered. He had the specific quality of a child who will one day surprise everyone. Georgia was 34 in 1888 and felt the particular satisfaction of a life that had accumulated into exactly what she had not known to hope for. She sat on the porch one evening in April when the desert was in its spring bloom again, with the sound of Jonas and Lily somewhere around the barn, and Riley asleep inside, and Raymond coming from the far pasture in the slant of the late sun, and she held the moment deliberately. The way you hold something you know is precious. Raymond came through the gate and saw her on the porch and raised a hand in greeting, the simple gesture that meant all the things that didn't need words after 10 years of marriage. She raised her hand back. He came up the porch steps and sat beside her and looked out at the land that was theirs entirely now. No debt, no Decker circling, no uncertainty about the water rights or the title or the future. Just the land and the cattle and the house and the people who had become the world. "Good evening," he said. "Good evening," she said. He took her hand. They sat in the April light and watched the sun go down over the western buttes, the sandstone that had once been the floor of an inland sea, millions of years of time compressed into stone the color of rust and orange and the particular red of the last sky. "I've been thinking," Raymond said. "About what?" Georgia asked. "About adding another section of land to the east," he said. "Caldwell's selling the eastern quarter of his lease. Thomas Caldwell is moving his operation north. The price is fair." Georgia considered this. "Is the water access reliable on that section?" "There's a seasonal creek," Raymond said. "Not as reliable as ours, but enough for the summer months if managed right." "Let me see the numbers tomorrow," Georgia said. "I'll run the arithmetic." He turned to look at her with that private smile. "You've been running the arithmetic in your head since I mentioned it," he said. She laughed. "Since before you mentioned it," she said. "Aurelio told me about the Caldwell land last week." "Of course he did," Raymond said. They were quiet for a while, the comfortable quietness of two people whose silences have substance. "Georgia," Raymond said. "Yes," she said. "I want to tell you something I don't say as often as I should." She turned to look at him. His expression was the serious and open one, the one without any of the reserve that had been there when she first met him in the dusty yard on a spring afternoon in 1878. "When you walked up to that gate with your carpet bag," he said, "I thought you were someone passing through, someone using the town as a waypoint. I didn't think anyone would choose this life deliberately." "Neither did I," Georgia said. "Not until I found it. What I want to tell you," he said, "is that everything that matters about who this place became is because of you. Not just the accounts and the teaching and the cooking, the whole character of it, the way the hands talk to each other, the way my children are turning out, the way I am, which is better than I was." Georgia was quiet for a moment. "You were already good," she said. "I just helped make use of it." "You made it possible to use," he said. "That's the thing." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they watched the last of the sunset complete itself, the sky going from orange to pink to the deep blue that comes before the stars. She thought about Nashville and the hotel kitchen and the $32 and the dead man's promise and the stagecoach arriving in Redemption Creek. She thought about the moment she had stood on the main street of that town with her carpet bag at her feet, looking at a place that seemed to exist by accident. She had found it was not an accident at all. Or perhaps it had been, but accidents could be the best kind of beginning. Jonas's voice carried from somewhere around the barn, telling Lily something with the authoritative tone of an older brother explaining important matters. Lily's voice came back at the same volume, not accepting the explanation, offering a counterargument. Riley would be waking soon from his nap. Georgia lifted her head and Raymond turned toward her and they kissed with the ease of people who have kissed 10,000 times and find each one as particular as the first, the specific gravity of two people who chose each other completely and have been making good on that choice ever since. "I'll start supper," Georgia said. "I'll get the children," Raymond said. They stood from the porch together, and the evening came in over the ranch the way evenings come in over the West Texas range, slowly and fully, the sky enormous and the land beneath it steady. And the lights of the Monroe house went on one by one against the arriving dark, warmth against the enormous outdoors, the particular illumination of a home that has been built with care and kept with love and which stands, solid and certain, at the end of a day that was like all the best days before it and all the best days still to come. In the years that followed, Redemption Creek grew from a waypoint into a real community. A proper school was built in 1890, 2 rooms and a dedicated teacher who came from Austin, and Georgia's Thursday afternoon teaching sessions became the foundation for a small lending library she established in the teaching room, which eventually held over 200 books collected from every direction, donated by families in the area, ordered from Amarillo and Fort Worth, and once from a bookseller in New York whose catalog she had found in a newspaper advertisement. Jonas grew into his father's shape and his mother's mind, and was, by his early teens, as capable a rider and cattleman as any full-grown hand on the ranch. He had Raymond's quietness and George's directness, and a patience with animals that Aurelio said was the kind you could not teach. Lily grew into something that neither of her parents had anticipated exactly, though both of them recognized it when they saw it. She had a hunger for knowledge that was specific and serious and unrelenting. By 10, she had read everything in the teaching room library and was writing long letters to Clara in New Mexico asking for book recommendations and receiving back enthusiastic replies. By 12, it was clear to Georgia and Raymond both that Lily was going to need more schooling than Redemption Creek could provide. The question of Lily's schooling became one of the great ongoing discussions of the Monroe household in 1894, approached with the same honest and open conversation that Raymond and Georgia had applied to every important decision. There was a girls' academy in Fort Worth. There was a school in Dallas that had a strong academic program. Clara had mentioned a school in Santa Fe. Lily herself, at 12, had opinions that were detailed and specific and not shy. Raymond told Georgia privately one evening that sitting at a table negotiating with Lily felt remarkably like sitting at a table negotiating with Georgia herself, which Georgia received as the compliment he meant it. They decided, with Lily's enthusiastic agreement, on the Fort Worth Academy. She would go at 14, board there for the school terms, and come home for summers and Christmas. It was not a small decision. The cost was significant but manageable. The distance was not enormous, and the alternative was letting a mind like Lily's go undeveloped for want of resources, which neither Georgia nor Raymond was willing to accept. Lily at 9 was developing in the direction of the careful observer Georgia had always seen in him. He had an interest in plants that bordered on the botanical, knowing the name and property of every plant within 5 miles of the ranch, with a precision that impressed even Aurelio. He also had a talent for drawing that surfaced early and which Raymond encouraged by buying him proper drawing paper from Percy's store, which Percy now ordered specially. Aurelio passed in the winter of 1893, peacefully, in his room off the barn, on a night when the stars were very clear and the ranch was quiet. He had been slowing for several months and had been comfortable and well tended, me taking on much of his care with the same good-natured competence she brought to everything. Raymond and Georgia buried him on the ranch, at the edge of the garden where he had liked to sit in the mornings, and Raymond made a marker from a piece of the good red sandstone from the buttes. The little boy named after him was 9 years old and stood at the burial with the seriousness of someone who understands that some events must be received with full attention. Holt took over the horse operation entirely after Aurelio, and did it with the respect of someone carrying forward a specific tradition. The ranch in 1895 was a different scale from what Raymond Monroe had been managing alone in 1878, and yet its essential character had not changed. It was a working place where work was taken seriously. It was an honest place where direct dealing was the norm. It was a place where the people who lived and worked on it were treated as people rather than instruments, which in 1895 in West Texas was not as common as it should have been, and which Raymond considered one of his father's better legacies, imperfect man that Jonas Monroe Sr. had been. The injustice of the time was not invisible to either Georgia or Raymond. They had seen it in the treatment of the Mexican workers in the area, in the casual cruelties of land policy toward anyone who was not white and Anglo, in the ways that the law bent depending on who stood before it. Aurelio had lived his whole working life in the West with the quiet, careful dignity of a man navigating a world that did not value him as it should. Raymond had seen this and had made deliberate choices in how he ran his operation. He paid the same wages regardless of a man's background. He defended his hands when they were treated poorly in town, and he used his influence as one of the more established ranchers in the county to push back against the casual dismissals that passed for normal. Georgia had done the same in the teaching room, where she taught every child who came regardless of their background or their language, and had been criticized for this by certain members of the community, and had received those criticisms with a polite directness that made clear she was not going to change her approach. They were not the only ones. Redemption Creek, for all its roughness, had a core of people who believed in treating other people fairly, and over the years this core had shaped the character of the town in ways that were slow and imperfect but real. Lily Monroe went to Fort Worth in the autumn of 1896, 14 years old, with a trunk of clothes that Georgia had spent the whole summer making, and a collection of books that filled a second case, and Raymond's written instructions to the academy staff about the specific quality of her mind, which he delivered with the earnestness of a father who needs the teachers to understand what they are receiving. The first weeks after Lily left were quiet in a way that took adjustment. Jonas, 16 and already running the cattle operation with Raymond almost as an equal, was not much for conversation in the way Lily had filled the house with it. Lily was there, 12 and increasingly occupied by his drawing and his plants, producing detailed botanical illustrations that were technically extraordinary for a 12-year-old and would have been impressive at any age. Georgia wrote Lily long letters every week and received long letters back, full of Fort Worth and the academy and the teachers and the other girls, written with Lily's specific voice, which was vivid and precise and occasionally devastating in its assessments. The letters were among Georgia's great pleasures of that period. Raymond, reading one of Lily's letters over Georgia's shoulder one evening, said, "She sounds like you." "She sounds like herself," Georgia said. "That happens to sound like me sometimes because some things came from me." He put his hands on her shoulders from behind. "Good things," he said. She put her hand over one of his. Outside the window the ranch was in the late light. Jonas, visible in the far corral doing something with a horse, released light on in the room he had made into a combined studio and natural history museum. The cook stove was warm behind her, coffee on. "I want to tell you something," Georgia said. He leaned down so his chin was at her temple. "Tell me," he said. "I'm glad I walked to this ranch in 1878, she said. "I'm glad Hector Baines was dead and Edna was gone and Percy Aldridge pointed me north." She paused. "I'm glad you needed a cook." He turned her gently so she was facing him. He looked at her the way he had looked at her from the beginning, with full attention and without any of the distances that people put between themselves and the things they love. "I'm glad you weren't afraid to knock," he said. "I was afraid," Georgia said. "I just knocked anyway." He smiled, the full smile. "That's the thing about you," he said. "You were always going to knock." They stood in their kitchen on a fall evening in 1896, in the house they had built into a home, with the sounds of their children and the land and the work they had made together around them. And the kiss they exchanged was the same as every kiss before it, and entirely new. The way the best things remain themselves across all the years they endure. In the morning there would be work and accounts and letters to write and cattle to tend and children to raise and a town to be part of, and a life to continue living with the full intention and mutual commitment that had characterized it from the beginning. The sun would come up over the Texas plains and find the Monroe Ranch exactly where it had always been, solid and working and full of the particular noise and warmth of a family that had built itself carefully over nearly 2 decades and had found in the building everything that mattered. Georgia Whitaker Monroe, who had come west with $32 and a dead man's promise, had found something far better than the cook's position she had been seeking. She had found the life she was built for, in the place she was meant to be, with the man she was meant to build it with. And the ranch stood against the Texas sky, as it would stand for years to come, the windmill turning in the morning breeze, the cattle moving in the far pasture, the garden green behind the house, the lights coming on one by one in the early darkness, warmth and intention against the wide world. A home made from dust and work and love that had been chosen, clearly and completely, and never regretted.